So I'm Tim May, I'm the current Managing Director at Kingsclere Estates. The land covers 2,500 acres and it was originally bought back in the early 1900s as about 200 acres for shooting from my great-grandfather, who was a solicitor in London. And my grandfather took the land on in the 30s. And then in his time he bought a further 1,500 acres. And then Father Robert brought 1,000 acres in his time. That's how we got up to that sort of area that we're at now. So the land is now split into 6 chunks between me, my 3 sisters and 2 cousins. And the farm is kept together through an AHA tenancy, a single generation tenancy, with the company Kingsclere Estates being the main tenant. So the idea is that that will last forever. So that should keep the land under one management control, but the capital value is split out to the individual family members. And that was done in the 1950s, that AHA set up.
In the 80s there was a period when there was no stamp duty, so our solicitor recommended that now was the opportunity to split it up. So rather than do it, we decided to skip a generation, so we both handed it over to our children, and then they became the landlords. Obviously, because they were underage, they had to have nominal trustees, but the rents were used to pay their education fees. Business was a limited company, and it had the tenancy over the whole block of land, so the change of ownership didn't affect the farming operation. And my father started to pass the shareholding on to the next generation, which was the position we were in. I became the major shareholder before he died, and gradually I've handed mine over until Tim then became the major shareholder.
So I came back to the farming business in 2004. At that time we were completely an arable unit, and we had buildings left from the dairy enterprise, which we were slowly starting to convert into commercial lets, and we had housing left over from the staff that we were letting out for residential. So I came back then and just carried on kind of with the arable farming as we did, but was sort of wanted to know that I was doing all this work largely for me and not for the benefit of my sisters and cousins who weren't really directly involved in the business. So it was always something that was in the back of my head, you know, how do I secure any wealth generation that I create through the business back to me, as opposed to onto the, you know, instead of being sort of diverted out. I did a Nuffield scholarship in 2011, and I suppose around that time I became even more aware that you know, I wanted to have a bit more security, and all that was left to my sisters and cousins at that time was shares in the business. So the land, as Dad said, had already been dealt with, so we had shares in the Kingsclere Estates, which was purely I guess like a land management umbrella, effectively. So I sort of said to Dad, well, you know, let's try and sort this next bit out. And I was quite keen that we did that when we were young, you know, in our 30s, because all the wealth that was released at that time by buying my sisters and cousins out of the company, they could use themselves to then go and set their own enterprises up. Now that we're all a bit older, I've still got quite a lot of the family still living and working on and around the estate. So they don't directly work for Kingsclere estates, but they carry out some of their business activities on the estate. And there's still the emotional history, there's still the emotional connection, where they'd say that they, it's their farm, understandably. So we still have some conflict about how I manage the farm and what I do with the farm, and it's still feeling like it's their land, which it is their land, but the business isn't. So we have to address that. And what we try and do is refer back to our tenancy agreement, so try and keep it as a landlord-tenant sort of relationship, so that we can talk about the running of the farm in business hours effectively, and then on the weekends when our kids are playing together, we don't have to then start talking about, niggling about how the business is run. And we also run an annual meeting, family meeting, to get all of those, all the landlords together and talk about where we're going with the farm, and give them the opportunity to raise issues with how their land's being managed. So what we've tried to do is make it much more of a formal relationship, so that then there's structures, because I've seen so many farms and family farms fall apart because of the arguments that can happen. So just trying to avoid those, or put processes in place, so not that we don't have disagreements, but that there's a way and a time and a place to deal with those disagreements. And that was really why important that Dad, I wanted to make sure that Dad was still around and still alive when we did the transition, because it sort of helps, he helps to be a middleman, to sit between my sisters and cousins and myself, and when things flare up, Dad's sort of been very good at being the mediator, and I'm not sure how that would happen if Dad wasn't here through ill health, or had died, and then we did all this transition after that time. I think it would be much more challenging really to have those discussions. So I'm trying to implement a lot of the findings of my Nuffield scholarship, which was sort of trying to embrace a bit of a circular economy, try and get much more integration of enterprises coming onto the farm, but without me directly sort of having the day-to-day involvement. So that's where we're trying to take the farm. With our commercial buildings, I can see how, while we're producing the raw material on the land, we could then use the buildings to convert that raw material into a processed product, and add value through that. So it's just trying to integrate the opportunities we have on the estate.
What am I doing? At the moment, on the estate, I basically have handed over all the day-to-day farming to Tim, and I'm still involved with the property side, the maintenance and the conversion of buildings, so that Tim can carry on with the farming, but we do liaise over it so that he's in the picture of what's happening. And I spend about 3 months of the year in France, where we have another property that is just a small vineyard.
3 top tips that I would have for people looking to start thinking about succession of the business is to start it early. I mean, I think we've gained massively from my dad still being around and active and mentally aware to be able to deal with conflict between the next generation. There's obviously, professional advice is important, but I think very often, with my wife's a counsellor, and I'm quite aware now from spending time with her that a lot of the decisions and the resistance to succession planning is to do with the emotions that are involved in it. And so I think that really understanding what your whole family is all about, and trying to deal with those dynamics before you get involved with the actual financial stuff. That's almost the easy bit, and it's those barriers in the first place that I think it's much more of a challenge. And I guess the third one probably would be to keep those routes of communication open, those channels, so that having that formal process I think is really useful.